Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our second Leadership Preparation Development Research Interest Group meeting of 2021-2022. So it's really nice that you can all join us and be with us. We've got three really interesting presentations today from newly completed PhDs and EdDs, and also from some research that Rachel's been doing over at Collective Ed. So really great to have some people with us from Collective Ed today, as well as people from BELMAS. Really great to be able to have a joint event in that way. We're passing the recording on to the Collective Ed people as well, so we hope we get a wider range of people. So do put comments up on Twitter, keep the conversation going about anything that you're interested in from today's contents. So I'm going to let Nidal, Chris and Rachel introduce themselves first, one after the other, and then we'll come back, Nidal, to your presentation. And then when we've done the three presentations, then I'll stop the recording for people who are watching this later on. We're going to have a comfort break and then we're going to carry on with our conversation about that. Does that sound okay to everybody? Okay. Yes. Nidal, you introduce yourself first because you're then going first. Then if Chris is there, Chris, do you want to turn your camera on if you're there? You can introduce yourself, and then Rachel can introduce herself, and then we'll come back to Nidal's presentation. Chris is a senior leader in a school, so he may have just turned his camera off and gone to deal with something, because we all know what schools are like. Okay, over to you, Nidal.
Thanks, Deb, for the introduction and for the invitation to this session. I'm looking forward. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited to see you all, and I'm excited also to share some findings from my doctoral research, as I'm now currently finalizing my thesis. So I would appreciate input and questions, and I look forward to an interesting session.
Thanks, Nidal. Chris hasn't put his camera back on, so I think he might have just gone away to deal with something, which is fine, so he can introduce himself later. Rachel, over to you.
Hi, I'm Rachel Lofthouse. I'm Professor of Teacher Education at Leeds Beckett University and founded Collective Ed, which is a centre for coaching, mentoring and professional learning. And that's all I need to tell you, I think. But yes, like Nidal, I'm very happy to have a conversation about the work. I'm not presenting it as a perfect piece of research by any means.
That's lovely, Rachel, thank you. So we'll come back to Chris in his introduction at the start of his presentation, and we'll move over to you, Nidal. And then what I think, if everybody wants to turn the cameras off while Nidal's presenting, we can just then listen, and then we'll do that for all three, and then we'll turn our cameras back on when we come back into conversation later on. So you should be able to screen share now, Nidal.
Not yet. Not yet. Can you please enable that?
It says I've made you co-host, so it should pop up.
Okay.
And if not, I can find, just bear with us everybody a second, I can find your slides that you sent me earlier, which is why we sent them. Chris has come back into our waiting room now as well, so that's great. Has it come through?
No, for some reason. Would you be able to share them?
Yeah, I'm sharing them. And so
Great.
If you just give me the nod when you want me to move them forward, I'm just waiting for those to load up now.
Great.
Hi, Chris, nice to see you. We'll come to your introduction just before you do the presentation. So you're going next after Nidal. Great that you've made it. Okay, so everybody should be able to see that now.
Perfect, thank you very much.
Okay.
So as I mentioned, this presentation is based on my doctoral research at the IOE, the Department of Learning and Leadership. And my study was conducted in Qatar and England international schools. And I looked at leadership praxis, leadership development, and the social impact of leadership. So for the purpose of meeting my research questions or answering my research questions, I used three theoretical frameworks: leadership theory, learning theory, mainly adult learning theory, and Bourdieu's social theory, to explore the fields where the schools exist and where leadership takes place in both countries. Next, please. It's important and also interesting to mention that my theoretical investigation and my empirical data, and I also would like to mention that I worked with 49 schools from both countries in a wide-scale survey questionnaire, and I also worked with 5 case studies, and I've interviewed for my case studies different people from each school. I interviewed head teachers, principals, or whatever the title is, senior leaders, middle leaders, teachers, and high school students. So the findings that I will be mentioning or referring to are a combination or an integration of all these findings together. For my initial literature review showed some gaps between the models that are used for leadership or for the practice of leadership, especially when I conducted my pilot study. So the initial findings also showed that there are some similar gaps in the field where students and teachers and some leaders mentioned that they were not really getting along together in the sense of response to social and cultural elements and needs. And also leaders mentioned that they have not been prepared to teaching internationally. So I decided to dig deeper into the literature and look for a theoretical framework that could help me to understand the role of leaders as adult learners and as adult educators. And of course, in addition to these key notions that I will be mentioning, there are different contextual factors that are influencing the practice and the learning of leaders in different ways. Next, please. So I went back to the concept that is probably an old concept, the concept of andragogy. And andragogy is not, obviously it's not new. It has been widely used in Europe, mainly in Germany and East Europe. And it was later reintroduced by Knowles in the States. So the concept of andragogy, despite different the debate and the different conceptualizations, it is mainly the embodiment of the philosophy and the practice and the methods of adult teaching and learning. And the elements are essentially self-directedness, independence, self-motivation, and experience as important factors to guide and drive adult learning. When I started collating my research findings, my data, and processing my data, I found out that there is something missing. There is a link, there's a gap between what leaders do and how they are prepared for this job and the field where they work. And especially in the school that I've worked in, they were all either IB schools or British international schools overseas. So the literature that I started with was not sufficiently helping me to explore, and I kept looking, and I found out that a critical andragogy or the transformative learning theory introduced by Mesira, which heavily leans on Habermas theory, was very helpful, and it helped me analyze and understand further the needs of leaders and the needs of teachers and aspiring leaders in schools, as well as linked to the needs expressed by students or the cultural and social needs that students shared with me in the interviews. Next, please. So the school leader or the head of school as an adult learner, through an adult learning theory approach, is basically and essentially expected to engage in a process of critical reflection, which is not only reflecting about the work they do, but also reflecting on the assumptions and the perception they have about the work and about the context in which they work and the whole social and cultural surrounding which influences the leadership in these schools. In addition, engagement in these social and cultural discourses and learning from others and with others was also essential and was seen to be very influential in all my data collection. So the transformative learning theory enables leaders to go through a process of examination of their own perception, but that doesn't only happen through dialogue and discourse and engagement and reflection. It also needs engagement and immersion in theory and in learning about leadership, in learning about teaching and student learning. And that requires further examination of their own learning, their own knowledge, in addition to immersion in the new context, which leads later to what is called, or what is defined by Mezirow as a shift of perspective, or the change of the meaning structure. And additionally, once these new notions or new perspectives have been shifted, have been developed, the habitus, which is the structuring structure or the disposition, the set of dispositions and skills and the ability to act on the reflection, this will be developed. And once developed and acquired, it will not be unacquired, despite additional learning that is constantly ongoing. So basically, this is the framework that I've looked at when I looked at analyzing leadership development in these schools. And it's also important to mention that I started with a notion of the leadership development as an individual professional development notion. And as I grew in my work, as my research extended for over 4 years, I noticed that the notion of social or collective action in leadership development was becoming powerful, important, and needed. And during the pandemic, the collective sense of professionalism in schools was extremely powerful, helpful, despite being seen as spontaneous sometimes. And in order to go back to that gap that I mentioned at the beginning, and how leadership, transformative learning theory can help leaders respond to the needs of the multicultural environments in which they work. So in addition to the notions of critical reflection and dialogue, the notion of communicative rationality as opposed to instrumental rationality was very powerful from Habermas theory. It allowed me to understand why and how leaders, aspiring leaders, and sometimes leaders without position, without appointment, they step forward and they practice their agency to lead, support, and help. And again, that was also empowered by the pandemic. So this allows them to embody a sense of recognition for the context in which they work in, to the social and cultural elements, and develop a sense of solidarity and act on change according to the new learning and according to their engagement with the field. Next, please. So in order for the leaders to lead for social and cultural justice, or to lead in a way that responds to the needs of their schools, the needs of their teachers, families, and students, it is not enough, definitely, for the leaders to remain engaged in their own learning and the learning of other leaders, but also to practice effectively the role of an adult learner, which is also a part of the word andragogy. So the leaders, as adult educators, have an amazing role that appeared to be extremely helpful and powerful in my research, and was appreciated and made a lot of difference. So professional interactions between leaders and other leaders and teachers throughout the school enable leaders to be a part of professional development sessions, a part of discussion groups, and to learn from their problems, to learn from their work, in addition to, of course, additional learning that they do individually through their organizational programs or organizational frameworks, or other courses they enroll in. So I remember that from the 49 principals that participated in the questionnaire, about 43 mentioned that engaging in professional conversations with teachers in their school was the most powerful form of professional learning that happens. And I think that also aligns with the notion of trust, building trust relationship that is powerful in the theory, in the transformative learning theory, and also showed to be very powerful in the school that I examined in my research. So professional interactions, trust relationship, and the recognition of the needs, abilities, and skills, and the background and the cultural and social capital that these teachers and leaders bring along with them to their schools are very important, but it is not enough in order for the transformation really to take place and to respond to the needs of this community, because each school is a different community and the diversity is very high in these schools. The notion of representation was very important and powerful. And by representation, I don't only mean, I'm not only referring to just recruitment, to recruit diverse people from multicultural backgrounds, but also to make sure that the different cultures and backgrounds where those teachers and students are coming from are represented not only in staff, but also in decision-making, in power, in activities, in so to share the leadership, to grow the leadership, and to make it really communal around the school. So the notion of shared leadership appeared through the inferences and through the analysis of my data, although it wasn't formally described in any of these schools. It was all hierarchically structured and very formal, but the analysis of emerging leaders, and I have to say that aspiring leaders or the young leaders in school were extremely energetic and extremely dynamic, and helped to embody this sense of shared leadership and to engage with the needs of their teachers and the needs of their high school students. So shared leadership, when the leaders or the head teachers, principals embody this sense of shared leadership and engage with learning and with discussions with teachers and other leaders in their schools, they allow a sense of engagement that is not only in a sense of speaking together or learning together, but physically to dedicate certain times for leaders to speak together, for teachers and teachers to speak and to listen, teachers to speak and to listen to students. So by engagement, and we're also referring to Bell Hook's sense of engaged pedagogy. And because these schools were highly multicultural and diverse, and because the notion of mobility and temporality is heavily descriptive of all their communities, so people keep going and coming, and then it takes additional time and additional effort for leaders to really build this sense of trust relationship within the school, and to get to know people and their backgrounds and their problems and their needs. And therefore engagement and discussions, again, are extremely important in this context. In addition, in order to build a school that is responsive to the social and cultural needs of the students and the teachers, pluralistic pedagogies and responsive curriculum structures are needed and important, and they have been essentially seen in this study, especially when I reviewed the findings with my participants. They kind of engaged in a process of reflection, and they shared a sense of need and reconsideration of what they do as pedagogical practice, and what they do and how they teach, and what is the set of resources, textbooks, authors, learning and teaching activities that is really taking place in the school. So there was a need for pluralistic pedagogies, for multicultural recruitment, and for responsive curriculum that includes and incorporates the voices of different teachers from different backgrounds, and also the voices and the needs, the cultural elements and the social elements of students. So leading in context of internationalization is not just like leading in any diverse context. It is much more than that. And the notion of diversity and internationalization in my research were quite different. So every context of internationalization embeds and embodies a lot of diversity, but the opposite is not necessarily true. So through this process, leaders guide teaching and learning, and when a responsive curriculum, a responsive pedagogic discussion has been emerging in the school, the sense or the notions of belonging, safety, and striving for students started to appear in our discussions. So while we started with IB organizational frameworks and the standards and evaluation and the formal evaluation of teaching and learning in the school and performance appraisals and student reports, we ended up 3 or 4 years later discussing inclusivity, pluralistic pedagogies and responsive curriculum. And we ended up in discussions with leaders and teachers looking for ways to incorporate the voices and the needs and the backgrounds, the narratives and the histories of families and students, and also of teachers in these schools. The last one, Deb, please. Can we move to the next slide? Thank you. I like to end my presentations usually with a map, just to acknowledge that the notions I've mentioned might be incorporated differently in our ways of thinking and ways of doing and ways of learning. They might mean different things on different spots on this map, including the social and cultural capital that we all bring along with us and that our students bring along with them when they travel around this map. Thank you very much.
That was really great, Nidal, and I can hear that you are ready to do your Viva, because you know your topic area really well. Bernie, nice to see you. Pleased that you got access. Sorry you were in a bit late for that. Really great, well done. So we'll come back to that because it raises lots and lots and lots of questions for me, and I know other people will have questions for you as well. So we're going to move on to Chris. Chris has been coming in and out, and I know school Wi-Fi can be tricky. So Chris, if you want to put your camera on.
Is my mic working, Deb?
Yes, your mic is working fine. Is that the one, because I've got you a couple of times on my screen, is that the one you're coming in on?
Yeah, so basically I've had to switch computers, and this computer doesn't have a camera, so I'm going to be camera-less, sadly.
Okay, but I've made you co-host on that one, so you should be able to share your slides, and if not, I will share them for you.
Sounds good. Let's have a look then.
Yeah, there we go.
Some boring
and
emails.
Brilliant. And while you're just setting that up, I must just apologize to Nidal, because I was trying to click onto her last slide and it just wasn't happening. So there we go. Right, over to you then.
15 minutes, Deb, is it?
Yeah, but if you just want to introduce yourself first and say a bit about your background, as you didn't do the introduction earlier on, that would be great. Thank you.
No problem, yeah. So my name's Chris Baker. Recently, I guess 2021, got my ED in educational leadership. I've got a slide later which tells you a bit about my role, because I work in what we call in the UK a MAT, a multi-academy trust, and I'll explain that a bit more. And my role within that organisation is the professional development lead. So it's an organisation of 22 schools, and effectively I sit in the central team with a lens on the professional development of teachers and leaders within each of the 20 schools. So without further ado, I was aware that we may have some people in the audience, with the whole acronym, acronym bingo about whether people know what a MAT is. So here's the definition. And so, effectively, it's a group of schools that have come together, primarily in a support mechanism, but there are other things that they do as well. It says here, of course, that the schools do remain separate entities. They keep their names, they keep their kind of Department of Education numbers, and they're also subject to individual kind of evaluation by the government. They have varying levels of autonomy. You'll find some multi-academy trusts in England where there is very little autonomy within the schools. And that usually plays out also in different compositions. So you'll have MATs that are primary based, secondary based, special needs based, and that sort of thing. We're a combination. And also you have multi-academy trusts that have different geographical links. So we're a very local multi-academy trust all in the southwest of England, but you'll have some of the larger MATs that stretch the whole length of the country. So that's a little bit about MATs so that doesn't trip us up. In terms of what the CLF is, have a read of that. So it's one of the larger MATs. It's reasonably well established, I guess. The two things I want to draw your attention to, which have got real relevance to this presentation, is that although we have 1,800 staff, 30% of those staff are non-teaching. So we have a huge professional services team, both in academies and in the centre. And as a federation, we are very protective of the autonomy for our academies. And of course, that creates challenges for anybody like myself who's trying to implement something across the whole MAT. As I said before, my role is PD lead, we call it, with a particular focus on education. I'm an ex-secondary, I guess I'm still a secondary teacher, I suppose, but my wife would say I'm an ex-secondary teacher. And my role really is to kind of review the PD that's happening, to guide them to create better PD, and then to provide any PD from the centre that they can provide themselves. In terms of this presentation, it's a bit of a double-edged presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about the EdD research that I did, but primarily how that's led to the attempt to develop coaching across my multi-academy trust and some of the challenges I've had, and that'll lead nicely into the rest of them today. So yeah, I did my doctorate in 2021. The focus was levels of self-efficacy in educational leaders. So those who are not familiar with self-efficacy, you know, the colloquial definition would be kind of task-specific competence. So much more granular than kind of global competence. I have got high levels of self-efficacy for presenting in front of teachers, but I have lower levels of self-efficacy for presenting in front of academics like yourself. And so this is granular as that. These were my research questions when the study happened. Give you a second. So I was primarily interested in where are we at the moment in terms of levels of confidence within leaders. Do they vary, and how? What is it that causes them to vary? How have they been developed? So leaders with high levels of confidence, how has that been developed? And the ones with low self-confidence, how has that kind of come about? And then, of course, naturally, that was led into it. And what could we do about that in terms of leadership training and development? It was a case study, mixed methods kind of methodology. And the headlines really were these. It is context specific. So we found differences in self-efficacy between kind of length of service, length in role, context of school, lots of different levels of leadership. So it certainly was even more kind of specific than the literature even suggests. We found that our current levels of PD were not mindful of self-efficacy sources. So Bandura, as you probably know, is the godfather of these things, and he identifies experience, vicarious kind of influence or observation, social persuasion as the three main ways that people make judgments about their confidence. And it looked and seemed as though we weren't really taking those into consideration when it came to leadership. The biggest one being that we weren't giving a lot of experience to leaders in their development of their leadership. The next one was that self-efficacy measurement must be regular. What it found was that our levels of self-efficacy are intensely temporal. They shift really dynamically, not as extreme as minute by minute, but certainly as soon as you've measured self-efficacy, it may have changed the day after. And so if you're looking to change your PD kind of program, you want to do that as close to the measurement point as possible. This is the one that my mum doesn't quite understand. So it basically turned out that leaders are most confident about the things they do most often. My mum's comment was about that I spent 5 years and £15,000 finding that out, and she probably could have told me that you get more confident of things you do more often before I'd started. So that was nice of her to do that. This is a really interesting. Lots of the qualitative elements of the study pointed to the fact that a direct superior has an incredible influence on somebody's self-efficacy. They have the power to build it and the power to kind of destroy it. And so that was a message that went out around, be mindful of your kind of the people who work for you in terms of their self-efficacy. And the one that's most obviously relevant today, it was overwhelmingly stark the amount of times that leaders who said they had high levels of self-efficacy referenced the presence of a coach. It was one of the strongest kind of findings, really. And that's what led me to then obviously try to push that across the Federation and in today's presentation. So these are the challenges that I'd like to talk about, really. There's a challenge around providing coaching for all staff. This idea of consistency versus autonomy is a challenge for us. Maximizing the impact of coaching has been a challenge. And then obviously systematic alignment. So I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes on each of those. we go through. So let's talk about coaching for all staff. So some of the considerations I had to make, as you saw before, we have a huge amount of kind of non-teaching staff. And so the kind of popular movement at the moment, which me and Rachel have spoken about at some length for instructional coaching, was not something that we could kind of just dip into. We couldn't just lift instructional coaching and just lay it out for every member of staff, because as you can see here, we have huge amounts of different kind of roles. We also have obviously different levels of expertise. That some of the models, are they lean heavily, don't they, either on you being a novice and it's more directive, to you being an expert and you being non-directive. We also have to kind of think about, as I was reminded, just because you've been in leadership a long time doesn't make you high in emotional intelligence. So that was interesting. We also wanted to use coaching for a variety of different reasons. We did want to use it for performance enhancement, but also, we wanted to use it as a lever for formal kind of, performance management, as well as induction into the kind of federation. And then, of course, one of the key things that my head teachers always talk to me about is that it has to be clear, Chris. Whatever you're going to talk to us about, I have to understand it almost instantly. If there's any confusion on my part, then you'll get variance. So we moved away from this idea of saying, okay, instructional coaching for teachers, leadership coaching for, executive coaching for execs, and developmental coaching in the middle. We wanted to move away from a multi-model kind of system. I won't go into this in too much detail, and I would love to talk to anyone outside of this. And Rachel actually has helped me massively in kind of refining this. This was the model that we sort of landed on, kind of low in structure and high in kind of responsiveness, to try and allow people the flexibility to move within the model, dependent not just on the person they're speaking to, but how that person is in that moment almost. So high levels of responsiveness. Again, we can talk about that another date. The autonomy one, as I said earlier, is interesting because we protect and we champion our schools to have high levels of autonomy, because of course they need to serve their own contexts, and they need to have that agency and motivation to not be told what to do, so to speak. So again, some of this will be familiar to you, but there is the literature does point to a psychological need for choice and for agency, and not to be kind of told what to do. But also there's the biological need. Leoty highlights how many kind of internal physiological things occur when choice is taken away from us. So it was really important that we do that. And as I said before, lots of different context. Now this is I guess a shout out directly to Rachel, because within all of the stuff that we talked about, and it was all gold, there was something that really struck me, because she challenged me a little bit on my need for this idea of fidelity, this idea that I wanted it to be the same. I wanted it to, the consistent. I didn't want people to go off and kind of, change it and all these things. And she didn't say it in this many words, but she basically said, don't sacrifice fidelity for maturity. Get it right to begin with, but then let it mature over time. And so that's been really influential in my thinking. And so where we've got to with the consistency versus autonomy, and that we're going to outline some enabling conditions that the literature then suggests are important. So we're going to try and create an almost readiness review, so that before schools seek to implement coaching, we have a conversation and a kind of I guess a review of where they are in terms of their culture, their capacity, levels of commitment and clarity. And then when in practice, we're going to try and kind of protect as much as possible these active ingredients. So this idea of, making sure that our academies and our coaches don't take out some of the things that are really, really important. Things like a feeling of partnership, safe environment, precision, planning, and then practice between sessions. So that's where we got to with that one. The maximizing impact one is interesting. I've met with some other kind of people involved in coaching, and a number of them told me not to just view coaching as a process or as a formal activity. And that rang true with me because, of course, not all of our schools, because of the level of autonomy that are given to them, want to engage in formal coaching or have the capacity. And so if we stuck with formal, my worries were that we'd have limited coverage. Lots of our schools are unable to protect time for coaching. It could be also that if we stick with formal, we lose some opportunities to kind of leverage some of the benefits of coaching. So of course, there's corridor conversations happening all the time that would benefit. Line management conversations would benefit. We're constantly providing feedback to people who work with us, and that might also be opportunities to do that. And then ultimately, I guess we're hoping to do such a good job with this that it does become part of our DNA, and that we are able to create some kind of, you know, upstream systems and stuff that actually help us. And so this was important, that the more of that, more people we got doing it, the more likely we were to develop that. And so again, this was the phrase that we've been using, aligned with that, this idea that we want all of our staff to intentionally use transferable elements of coaching in their line management and corridor conversations. Nothing particularly groundbreaking, but it splits between having a coaching mindset and then carrying out some core coaching actions. So you can see here that we're pushing people to be really connected during those conversations, to not have an internal filter that's kind of in the way of it, to be really curious and to make sure that they're getting to the heart of the issue before they, you know, take any action, and not to think of themselves as the fixers, you know. Think of themselves as somebody who's helping the other person to build some capacity so they don't have to come back and ask again. And that basically plays out, as you can see, in terms of listening more, asking more questions, and then making sure that, you know, any conversation finishes with a tight kind of action. So the last one I want to talk about really is a bit more of the cultural thing, which no doubt will take a lot of time to develop, but we're starting with the end in mind, I guess. And so, as I said before, we've got this kind of variance within the academies. And one of the interesting things, of course, is lots of our schools sadly have had negative interactions with coaching in the past. And so they're holding on to, either individually or kind of collectively, a bit of baggage around that. And so that's something we have to slowly unpick. We've got a lot of systems as a large map within that, and which is important that I make sure those are aligned so that I'm not working at the coalface, so to speak, on developing coaching, and yet the systems up above don't even support that. So lots of stuff like that. And effectively, this is where we're at the moment. I think I can hear people giggling in the back, but I am kind of obsessed, I think, with alliteration recently. I'm probably overly obsessed. I need to kind of wind it in. But these are the sorts of things that we're trying to develop high levels of. And that plays out effectively in some key actions, I suppose. Getting commitment right from the top, making sure that coaching is visible in all of the vision and strategy documents, as well as the budget, you know, aligning it with HR processes to make sure that we, you know, any performance management or professional development processes have a coaching stuff. Actively building internal capacity. And then, of course, the toughest one in schools, I guess, is making sure that we are protecting enough time and regularly so that people can do justice to the process. So next steps. I've been working on this really so far since January. Where are we at the moment? What's the best practice out there? Can we create a CLF specific process? And then what do people think of it? We've got some schools that are piloting it at the moment, which would be interesting. And that speaks to the kind of maturity that we're looking for now. This idea that schools are saying, that's great, Chris, but this didn't work or that didn't work, as well as working with HR. And then, of course, first part of next year, hopefully we'll have more schools coming on board to do pilots and to test and learn and refine. And then to start doing the wider training and to start trying to create, interestingly, an internal senior leadership coaching capacity, because as you saw before, we've got layers of leadership, and our exec leaders we want to protect that psychological safety and feel that maybe internal coaches at that level probably wouldn't work. So we need to kind of do that. Okay, and that was it for me.
Lovely. Thanks very much, Chris. There are lots of questions I've written down here, and I know others will as well. And I think that followed on kind of quite nicely, really, from Nidal's presentation as well. So that's great. Thank you very much indeed. And we will see you physically later on when you turn your camera on for our conversation. So, Rachel, you should be able to share your own slides. No,
currently it says that you've disabled it.
Oh, right, here we go. So, thank you. Should allow me.
Yeah, got it.
Got it. Yeah, I think it just took a while to move across from Chris's. That's great. Okay, over to you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. It's been really, really interesting already this afternoon. And I think the point that Chris raised around this issue around fidelity versus maturity in coaching practices is one that is going to resonate with me, even though it's something I'm very conscious of and aware of. It keeps bubbling up in a number of different settings. And I think I'll keep thinking about that more myself. I'm going to share with you, it's kind of a slice of research, and it is related to coaching, so it builds on from what Chris has talked about, but this particular slice is also very much related to leadership. So I'll give you a sense of where this has come from. Over the last few years, I've had the real privilege of being able to undertake evaluation type research of a number of different coaching practices in different educational settings, with each of those coaching practices necessarily having a slightly different structure, a slightly different model, for example, of funding, and also a different intended specific purpose. But in each case, the idea of bringing coaching into an educational setting is to support those people working in that setting, whether as leaders or teachers or early career teachers, for example, to gain self-confidence, to feel a greater level of competence and efficacy, and to therefore make a more positive contribution to the work of that school. And if that is about them sticking around for longer, then that allows them to make a more positive contribution to the work at that school. If it's about them developing more nuanced pedagogy, then that's enabling them to make a more significant contribution to the school. So coaching can be used for a variety of things, and my evaluations have allowed me to start to disentangle some of that. We often, when we hear about the value of coaching, rely on self-report. So people identifying coaching as being a contributor to their leadership development or capacity or skills, for example. And what we don't often do is track a coaching program across a period of time. And what I was able to do, and it was gradual in terms of 3 examples of coaching practice coming over a number of years, and my evaluation of them coming over a number of years, I was able to write about 3 examples of coaching practice of which I had evidence from the inception to the end of that coaching cycle, that year, because in each case, the work I'm referring to happened over the course of a year. I'm going to talk about activity systems and the way in which activity systems can help us to judge the efficacy of coaching. In other words, if we want to know what the value of coaching was, then an activity system analysis might help us to deduce that. And that's essentially what this short presentation is about. I have published a paper related to this, and I can share the details of that later on. And in that paper, there are 3 examples of coaching. So the one I'm going to talk about today, which is about head teacher coaching, but also coaching embedded in a strategic school improvement funded project in 10 primary schools with a focus on raising the quality of teaching and attainment in maths through enhanced metacognitive pedagogy. And thirdly, the use of coaching as a means to engage teachers and speech and language therapists to work together to focus on communication-rich pedagogies in early years and primary settings in a multilingual school or multilingual schools in an inner city in England. So they're very different types of coaching, but what was good for me was that I'd been tracking them each for a whole year and had a variety of forms of data in relation to each one. And then this paper is a chance for me to say, okay, so looking at 3 case studies, is there value in using activity systems to help judge the efficacy? And as I say, my case study today is the leadership one. So just a quick vignette to just kind of ease you into this notion of activity systems. This is, I haven't quite made this up, but it's just a vignette and illustration. So imagine a mat. Now, fortunately, Chris has just explained what a mat is. So a group of schools. And in this mat, they want to support their new pastoral and curriculum leaders. Those appointed over the last, say, 12 months to gain confidence and capacity in their roles. So they've got maybe 15 new people in these roles across the Multi-Academy Trust. So the main object of this, the intention, is leadership development, because that will be to the good of the schools, to the good of the individuals in their leadership roles, the people they lead, those people who they lead, teach and work with. The leadership development is the object. And what we're going to say is we're going to call this an activity system. So in other words, amongst all the other work of that Multi-Academy Trust, there is an activity system focused on leadership development. With the object of leadership development. Now, what does that activity system look like? Well, first of all, it's worth asking us, why does it even exist? Well, we've got a purpose, but it's also driven. So this activity system might be being driven by the members of the senior leadership team in the MAT and the trustees, because they've identified the need to support and develop their new middle leaders. And so the people who are driving this are seen as the subjects. They are, if you like, responsible for, in charge of the activity system, and they're pushing it on. What they would do, presumably, is they'd create some kind of leadership development plan, which had these middle leaders at the heart. And this plan would itself act as a tool. It becomes, if you like, a map of the things that they intend to do. It allows them to think, well, at what point will we be able to judge whether we've been successful? Because perhaps in this plan, there are time, there's a schedule and there's a sense of progress that will be made over time. And the leadership development plan also has to be coherent with and consistent with all of the other school improvement plans that exist in this MAT. So there's a congruence that has to be developed that will influence the way the leadership development work is designed and supported. So what we have is we have an object, leadership development, that gives purpose. It gives purpose to the current work of these middle leaders, the pastoral and curriculum leaders, and those who support them. And there is a whole host of things that will influence and be happening within this activity system. And you can see some of those. Some of those are directly related to the leadership development, but others are existing in the system and will influence the leadership development. And I will give you an example. If you are a new middle leader of, let's say, a subject like maths or English or science, the attainment grades of those subjects in English schools are seen as being measures of school quality, and they are highlighted and profiled above many other subjects. Also, those subjects are all compulsory, so the volume, the number of children studying those subjects to examination level is always high. The departments will be quite big because you've got large numbers of children studying to exams, and those exams are really critical in how the school is judged internally and externally. So it might be, for example, that although there is a general object to support all new curriculum and pastoral leaders, there's a particular intensity if some of those people are in these high stakes, more powerful departments. So that there is a power relationship that might be existing here. So one of the ways that we can start to conceptualize and analyze this is using an activity system approach. And it comes from the work of Engerstrom and others. And if you're not familiar with it, you're going to be a little bit bamboozled by it today, but hopefully not so much that none of this makes sense. They essentially recognize that if there is a distinct object of the activity system, so let's say it's leadership development, then that will or won't be achieved according to certain influences within the system. So it might be achieved at a really high level of success. Very effective leaders develop very quickly, make a huge difference to the school and the school community, or it might be a bit of a damp squib. It might really be, just not really gain momentum, not really gain impact. Indeed, it could almost possibly act in reverse. So too much attention on these people, for example, might actually cause them to become more vulnerable and perhaps start seeking alternative places to work or alternative roles. But the object is clear. What is less clear are the outcomes. We know what we're trying to do in this activity system, but what actually results, what the outcomes are, you can only tell down the line. They're not necessarily the same. What will influence the object turning into the outcomes is the way in which other elements within the system interact with each other and with the object. And that's what activity system analysis or theory is all about. The diagram tries to show that. It's not my diagram, it's the original diagram. And my definitions or my notes to the side give some indication of what this presentation is going to reveal in relation to leadership or head teacher coaching. So just to quickly highlight those, certain tools are used, like, for example, a leadership development plan in the MAT vignette, okay? What that does is it corrals certain resources and time, and all of that acts within a certain kind of framework or set of written or unwritten rules about how this community works. Some people are going to be driven towards supporting the object, and their work, their time will be allocated towards it. Some people that will be written into job descriptions. For some people, it will be more informal. So within this community, there will be a division of labor that is focused on, or not, the object of this activity system. So there might be a senior leader responsible for that improvement plan and keeping an eye on what's going on with these new middle leaders. That person's division of labor, it might be quite substantial compared perhaps to another senior leader who has a different remit in the multi-academy trust. And then there's a whole series of these things that, if you like, are in the system that we call mediating artifacts, because they mediate the difference between the object and the outcome. So let's have a look at that in relation to coaching. So the paper that I had published a year ago, I guess. No, not even quite a year ago. As I say, it analyzes 3 examples of coaching in education using activity systems to judge the coaching efficacy. So the first thing I had to do was start to conceptualize what might an activity system for coaching in education actually look like. And what might a generic object be? So in the gray box there, this is my best current thinking about what the object of coaching in education would be, okay? And it doesn't matter really whether it's instructional coaching or leadership coaching or well-being coaching. What is it for? Well, it's for the learning and well-being of educators and learners. So the children and young people who those educators serve, it's for their learning and well-being, with the coachee's focus, so the person who's actively being coached, having the coaching being focused on their own learning and their needs in order for them to be able to focus on others' learning and needs. So there's a, if you like, it's like a hourglass, got these broad objectives funneled through individual one-to-one work, usually in coaching, through an individual supporting their needs so that they can support the learning and development of others. And I would be pretty strong in saying that any coaching and education which doesn't do that, enable that educator to support the learning and development and well-being of others, is probably not worth doing. And even asking yourself the question, does it make a difference to the learners? And how might we judge that has to be relevant. So that's the object. Well, between the object and the thing that actually happens, and Chris mentioned that, you know, some schools have tried coaching and not had a positive experience of it. So, but their object would have been that this will have a benefit to our teachers or our leaders, which will have a knock-on effect to our learners. But where it doesn't work, it's because the connection between the object and the desired outcome is fragile, and therefore you get different outcomes. So this notion of the extent to which the object and outcomes are aligned is the interesting thing in relation to the activity system. And of course, the extent to which the object and the outcomes are aligned is going to be dependent on what is actually going on in the system. So what is supporting the object, what is interrupting it, what is interfering with it, what is distracting from it, what is enabling and empowering it. But also, this is a cognitive process. It might result in changes in behavior and action in terms of professional practice, but coaching is about sense making. And the system either enables or disables that sense making. So this diagram, if you like, provides some sense of a template of how we might understand coaching as an activity system. Okay, and I'm not going to spend ages on it because it will become more alive, I hope, when I explain it through the case study. So this case study that I'm choosing to share with you, it's a case study of head teachers being coached. It happened about 3 years ago. It was part of a 4-year program funded by one of the teacher unions. And we were asked to evaluate 1 year of this head teacher coaching provision. In that 1 year, there were 39 head teachers coming from primary, secondary and special schools, all in England. And the reason that the union was interested in funding the coaching that they then recruited a coaching organisation to run was because they, as a union, were conscious of the intense pressure and development needs of many head teachers. So they wanted their head teachers to experience sustained well-being and also to gain increased capacity in leadership and management, so that actually the system benefited from their work, and the head teachers themselves stayed in the job, flourished in the job, had a positive impact in the job. So the coachees were the 39 head teachers, all of whom were volunteers, as in nobody was coerced, they wanted to be coached, but they were very different. Not only were they from different types of schools, but some had been head teachers for just a few months, others had been head teachers for up to 17 years, some in more than one setting. So they were different. They weren't all kind of a little box of, this is all the brand new head teachers that need coaching, otherwise, you know, they might struggle. They were very different. And the coaches who they worked with were also quite different to each other. But the thing which brought them together was that they were all associates of the particular coaching organisation that had the contract for this work. The coaching was described by the programme leader as ontologically based. And I'll try and explain a bit more about what that is as we go on, but because we have it as a research type word, but in this context, it has a particular meaning. But as you can see, it had a certain structure across the whole year, face-to-face coaching sessions. This was pre-pandemic, just pre-pandemic. 6 of those across the year, so essentially 1 every half term, with the head teacher setting the agenda and the coach helping them to make meaning. And then the key thing here, the dialogue in the coaching conversation being the, the stimulus for that meaning making, and the skills of the coach enabling that to happen. The head teachers also came together collectively at the beginning, at the end of the year, so that although the coaching was all one-to-one, they were also, they saw themselves as part of a cohort, and there was some peer support as well. And the coaches themselves also came together through group supervision programs. And as you can see, that tells you when this happened, 2018-19, there had been groups of coaches in the preceding and following years. So let's just focus in on that. So in this case, yes, the object of coaching generally is the learning and well-being of educators so they can support the learning and well-being of others. But the specific object was the school leaders, the head teachers. And for them, for the union, it was about acknowledging the struggles that some of them have faced and the need that they would have for further development at whatever stage they were in, or at rather, in leadership. And the fact that we do lose too many head teachers in school systems, and it's an attempt to try and reduce that retention loss. That's not the right word. And therefore, the word that I guess we came to, and I think aligned with this, was a notion of a sustainable profession. You know, one where there was a lot of learning, a lot of flourishing, a lot of commitment, and a lot of capacity, rather than a profession of burnout. Because without that sustainable profession, it's really hard to see how, over time, schools can be continually led well. So the object of this coaching was to support those head teachers. And it was anticipated that they would experience personal and professional growth, and that would enable them to support the learning and development of others, because that's the job that they do. That was the object. The coaches, in this case, we described as the subject. So they are the people who are coming into the system to try and enable the object to be achieved. And as you can see, there's a description there of those coaches. They were very experienced, in the most part, with at least 4 years experience as a coach, up to 20 years experience. And they had a variety of other professional past and current roles that might seem irrelevant, but were actually hugely interesting in terms of what that gave them, in terms of their depth of knowledge and experience and expertise within the coaching role. And one of the things about this project was, in our research, we focused on both the coachees, the head teachers, and the coaches throughout the year. So we gained a knowledge of both, and an understanding of what the community, if you like, of coach and coachee meant in terms of building this sustainable outcome. And as you can see, there's a quote there from the program director about something about her coaches. So these people, she needed them to be credible, she needed them to share the values of the organisation, because that was what the organisation was commissioned on the back of, as well as its capacity to put together a really good coaching programme. So the coaches had to have a good understanding of the life of head teachers in an education sector. They weren't neutral coaches, they were coaches who were informed, intelligent, experienced within that sector. But they hadn't all been head teachers by any means. It wasn't that, it wasn't mentoring, it was coaching. And they needed to have this capacity to have these long conversations and ask good questions. And there's a lot more to it than that, but that's the bottom line. Coach has to be able to sustain a high quality dialogue, because it needs that time and space over time to really create the impact that coaching has the potential to create. Now, what we discovered in our research was what the value of those coaches were to the head teachers. And many of the head teachers had experienced coaching in other programs, in other forms, at other times in their previous leadership lives. And they were able to distinguish what was specifically beneficial about this program compared to not all, but some of their other experiences of coaching. And this is important, I think, to recognize why the subject makes a difference. The coach, it's not the coaching on its own, it's the coach and that collection of coaches that made the difference in this case. So what were the tools that were adopted? Well, relatively simple in this case. There was no high-tech stuff. Nobody was going in and video recording leadership work to analyze it and scrutinize it. There wasn't anything, there were no paraphernalia. The key tools that the coaches had at their disposal was their ability to ask really good questions. So it's a semantic-based tool, it's a language-based tool, but it's also one which is not formulaic, but which is guided by some guiding principles, so that actually there were some question themes which were current across all of the examples, and that kind of evolved across the course of the year. And that was such a key tool to the way that this did or didn't work. What about these mediating artifacts? So in other words, what, as well as the who is it, the coaches, and the what are they doing, the nature of the dialogue, but actually what is it also in the system that is or isn't influencing the degree to which the object of coaching is matched to the actual outcomes of coaching. So in this case, we can start to analyze the rules, the community, and the division of labor. And even things like the head teachers saying, one of the things I value about, in focus groups, it was kind of a pretty much universal comment, that they valued having to travel some distance from their school to their coaching session, up to 2 hours. It was always in an agreed destination. It was never conducted on the school site. It was always somewhere else. And the venue seemed to be quite relevant because it had been their choice, but also the fact that they often had to make the effort to get there on car, on the train or in the car, and the associated time to think. I kind of think about it as sort of a decompression moment before you drive away from school, or instead of driving to school, you drive to your coaching session. And it allows for your mind to settle a little bit, and for you're not fielding phone calls and knocking on the door, etc. And you focus and you're ready for your coaching. And then following the coaching, you've got that return trip. And that gives you, again, that period of time to process, to think. So even though that seems slightly arbitrary and random, you could say, well, that's a representation of the labor, the time that the head teachers put in to make this work. Another example, if you think about the rules, so there have to be some contract, and they were all contracted. In other words, head teachers and coach had a coaching contract for their work. And one of the rules there was that, this was a coaching relationship with a coaching conversation. But there may be no moments where the coach recognized that the head teacher needed something other than coaching. And the rule was that even if you were a therapist, and some of these coaches were also therapists, if they thought actually this head teacher needs something a bit different, they could do with some additional counseling. I'm not here to do that, but I am, with their consent, able to signpost them to the fact that this looks like something that might need an additional form of support, and look, take that away, think about it, rather don't expect me to be the counsellor, kind of thing. So there's a whole series of rules which relate to how the community is developed over time. The community was interesting, and this doesn't illustrate all of it, but there's something about the coaches coming together for supervision that makes a difference. So they're gaining insight and expertise together throughout the year, which is then informing the way that they work as coaches. There's also something about the community that the head teachers formed amongst each other, even though they only met at the beginning and at the end of the year, knowing they weren't alone, knowing that other people had sought out coaching, was actually a really empowering feeling of community with other colleagues in other schools. And then also the fact that the coaches didn't just work on this program that wouldn't have paid their bills. They were coaching across a number of different programs and privately, etc., etc. But all of the experiences they had as coaches, if you like, situated them within these really rich, intelligent communities that became an extended community that enabled them to make sense of what, in that moment, that head teacher was saying. So some of the hidden messages that were coming, being recognized because these coaches had this broader community they worked in. So what did we think, what did we discover, if you like, when we looked at the extent to which, in this case, the object and the outcomes were aligned? Well, the activity system makes sense of itself, and it either does or doesn't create that alignment. And what we were able to deduce was that there was, for the vast majority of these head teachers, a very positive self-report in relation to the coaching. But we could also look at the coaches and talk to the coaches about what they saw in relation to the changes that the head teachers that they had worked with had gone through. So there was two different ways of making sense of that. And then when you start to unpick it, you start to see what it is that the coaching helps the head teacher shine a light on, or prioritize, or make some more some different strategic decisions in relation to. And and when you say, well, how do you know it was the coaching? It was things like, well, in the coaching, I rehearsed the conversation I needed to have with my senior leadership team, which enabled me to move that, if you like, that obstacle on, move it away, and open up the space for us as a senior leadership team to work differently together. So there's all sorts of ways in which they could identify this connection between the coaching and what they were actually physically doing in school. There were also a number of really interesting revelations about how they felt their work-life balance had been reconceptualized, and some of the decisions they'd made, you know, including things around diet and preserving time for children. And also, for one or two of them, the coaching had allowed them to think about whether they were the right person in that role at that point, or whether they wanted to seek alternatives. But in every case, any alternative was still within education and within leadership, but possibly not in that place. So there was a huge amount of sense making going on. And in particular, this was recognized as being identity work in the coaching. And this is a good example, and there's no way you're going to read all of this now, but because an example of, what it was the coaches said they believed successful coaching should enable, and what the head teachers recognized it had enabled. And we collected this data separately, so there wasn't a kind of a groupthink going on. There were, there's points of alignment here. So again, I'm not going to read this all to you, but what this is able to do is make some sense of how the object and the outcome are aligned in most cases. So activity systems for me have been quite helpful in judging, as a tool to judge the efficacy of practice. What we have to also acknowledge, however, is that we can, if you like, extract information and create a lovely model of an activity system of something like coaching in education. But what we can't forget is that in education, there are multiple activity systems operating at the same time, in the same place, and at different scales. So if you really want to make sense of this, you've got to take a step back as well and understand, for example, the activity system that is driving schools towards a performative set of outcomes for Ofsted, for league tables, for exam results, etc., and how that might be impacting on the activity system that is coaching. And some general conclusions here, and you can read more about these if you're interested. The notion that coaching in education certainly isn't a monolithic process. It's a very diverse and divergent practice, and we can welcome that, acknowledge the value of that. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't know whether it's working. We can we do need to have some means by which we say, to what extent is our effort in bringing coaching into education making a difference to individuals and schools and colleges as whole communities? So what this study does is just allows us to shine a bit of a light on that. And the unusual thing, relatively unusual thing, is the tracing of this practice from beginning to end across the course of the year for each of these three cases that I mentioned. There's evidence rather about personal and professional formation and growth coming from coaching, but it isn't guaranteed by any means. And there's also this interesting piece around coaching being individualized, but the ripple effects not being isolated to that individual. And so one of the things here is, if you like, taking away some of the pressure for performance coaching, where it's all about an individual and their performance. Because of course, as Nidal said, schools are collective in communities, and actually it's about how we come together and bring all of our resources to bear and have those sparky conversations, and those make a difference. It's not about individuals and their performance, even though coaching is an individualized practice. And I think there is something here about the role of coaching as it bringing in what can be really transformational relationships into the lives of teachers and school leaders. And I will stop sharing. Yes, that is where I'm stopping. Sorry, I have no idea how long that took.
No, really don't worry. I think we were all kind of engrossed in the delivery, so we're absolutely fine with the fact that we've run over a bit. I'm going to stop the recording. So if you're watching us online, thanks very much for joining us. And I'm sure there's a Twitter dialogue, hopefully, that you can pick up with other people.